What's happening in the world of museums, and what will leaders in museum education need to be prepared for in the future? Bank Street's Leadership in Museum Education program has existing strengths. First, it allows students the flexibility to work and attend the course on weekends. Secondly, it acts like a mentoring program, putting students in direct contact with leaders in the field. And thirdly, it convenes in New York, which offers a rich array of learning opportunities at numerous museums covering many disciplines. What's happening generally in the world of museums today? Museums have experienced several decades of tremendous growth, building collections, programs, and new buildings. They've excelled at maximizing their physical assets, and they measure their success on the basis of physical visits to their sites. That is all changing. Museums are under financial constraints, partly as a result of the increased cost of expanded operations. And there's an increasing need to justify the museum's role in society. Museums are also having to reposition themselves as part of the online world. And along with that comes expectations that the museum will be more transparent and interactive. We need to consider the term museum educator. The word education in a museum is often equated with teaching, particularly teaching school children and fellow teachers. This will continue to be important for building future audiences. But most museum educators today recognize that learning appeals to all ages, especially adults, since, with the exception of children's museums and zoos, adults are often the largest segment of a museum's audience. We're beginning to see now museum education being renamed various things, such as visitor engagement or interpretation. Interpretation can mean the whole way a museum presents itself, from the website through the visit, to the way information is presented in the galleries, to ways that the public can give feedback. But interpretation can also be the way that specialized information in the museum is translated for a more general audience. Engagement sounds very proactive, but it could also imply being more receptive. The museum reaches out to you, but is also willing to listen and incorporate your ideas. So what we call museum education, what museum education calls itself, has important implications for what it will do both now and in the future. Museum educators have traditionally been strong advocates for the learning needs of students and visitors to the physical site of the museum. Now they need to become advocates for increased visitor participation. They need to become facilitators for participation, for example, how to gather visitor feedback, how to capture input through crowdsourcing, to pitch ideas that will receive funding, or to determine whether a program will generate interest or not in the community before it even happens. Educators need to move from transmitting information one way to sharing and generating information from multiple sources. This will require modeling new types of programs and rethinking relationships with audiences, stakeholders, and with fellow museum employees. Whatever they're called, museum educators in the future will need to become proficient at interpretive planning for the whole museum, and they'll have to build participation in the museum from the outside in, not just from the top down and out. They'll need to think about which programs take place at the museum, which programs take place online, and which programs can partner with other groups and organizations off-site. So it needs to be a rebalancing of the whole program mix, and even what some of the staff are assigned to do. For example, how do you develop partnerships with businesses in your community to encourage creativity or entrepreneurship, or to encourage sustainability or cultural diversity? In other words, education will need to be able to articulate the museum's relevance to a broader community in ways that are meaningful to that community, and not just in terms that are familiar to the museum. To make these sort of transitions, museum educators need to know how to manage change. often within the organization as much as outside the organization. The traditional view of leadership is someone visionary and charismatic, and that's still current. But increasingly, today's leaders of nonprofits need to be people who help others achieve common goals. Museum educators need to learn how to communicate up and down, inside and outside the organization. They build vision collectively. They also need to be comfortable working collaboratively across disciplines, particularly the relationship of education to other departments. Let's face it, being a leader in a museum and its community is not easy. One needs to be resourceful, one needs to have stamina. You are going to meet with resistance to change. Museum education leaders need practice championing ideas, being flexible, pitching proposals, having a clear position while maintaining collegiality and supporting the overall mission of the museum. You know, our handheld technology today has conditioned us to expect instant information, instant feedback, actions, results. Often, though, change comes slowly, and a new idea may take years to materialize or to win people over. Confucius said that education is like jade, because, you know, in ancient times in China, it took years to work a piece of jade. So education is a lifetime endeavor. Clearly, right now, the biggest development in technology is social media. Now, there's an expectation among museum employees that technology drives a lot of the decisions. Oh, you know, let's do this, or there's this new app, let's try that. We need to have this. In fact, technology is really the delivery platform. And it will be important for museum educators to still develop the content, the what, the why. Why are we doing this? And then decide which platform best suits that purpose. Marketing has benefited greatly from social media. Museums, though, I feel are still in the early stages of developing things like online learning and shared curation of museum programs and even exhibitions. Future leaders need to be prepared for these changes. Despite the informal nature of learning in a museum setting, there are still many in the core audience who want to learn in a formal way, for example, through courses online. Museums traditionally each develop their own learning materials, but in the future, museums will form consortia to pool their resources and broaden their reach. The online world, after all, has trained us all to look for information in many places, not just at one site. At universities, research in the digital humanities is encouraging different disciplines to work collaboratively on a common theme or subject. Similarly, educators will need to plan for greater collaborations and form partnerships and consider even unconventional ways of delivering content. Think, for example, of how the Metropolitan Opera delivers broadcasts of its performances in movie theaters all across the country as a way to build audiences. Curators will no longer be the sole voice of authority, but will periodically arrange for shared curation of exhibitions. You can see examples of this already emerging at places like the Oakland Museum, which just reinstalled its entire permanent collection, or the Portland Art Museum, which has object stories, where the public actually bring in objects and then present those objects, and those are displayed. So these are objects that are personally interesting to them, not necessarily things that just belong to the museum. Let's bring the attention back to the Bank Street program itself. I have a few suggestions. One is, I think the program needs a signature event, perhaps an annual mini-conference that is staged at the college or at a host museum, and that gathers together education leaders in museums to reflect on current practice and answer questions that have been generated in advance through social media. Secondly, I think the program could develop a greater online component. For example, a certificate form of the program that could be targeted towards international students, culminating in one single New York visit or experience. This online certificate could extend interest in the program to a wider constituency and act as a feeder to the more intensive master's level program as it exists. Both the signature event, the online program, and the current master's program could have a greater presence on YouTube, meaning that documenting program highlights and milestones will be important to market the program to a wider audience. Moving forward, future leaders in museum education will still need a solid grounding in what the program offers now: fundamentals of museum education, organization, and management. But with increasing emphasis on collaboration, cross-disciplinary work, even stretching the definition of what is an education department. Harnessing new media to increase participation from communities of interest outside the museum, becoming facilitators of change, and being someone who builds shared meaning. Museums have the capacity in our communities to affect change, to articulate shared values and aspirations, and to become hubs of information where information is gathered and dispersed. Leaders in museum education will be critical to these changes and need to be prepared for an active and expanded role in bringing museums, people, and ideas together. Thanks very much.